All right. So I have a very special guest today. I have Thomas Winn with me. We got introduced. I got messaged by Cadell. He said that it would be wonderful to talk with Thomas. Um, After all, I really did enjoy your talk with Cadell on negation of negation and the sort of idea of becoming. I also realized that you're coming from a Christian background, so I thought it was like a very interest. I thought it would be a very interesting dialogue about how do we sort of go through this idea of negation and even trying to hold on to some type of religion at the same time. What is that? What does that look like? And I know in our exchanges we sort of gone through, like, I proposed, like, the mystics have like this very good notion or embodiment of negation where, um, for them it almost doesn't even matter to the extent of the content of the tradition too much. It's more about their letting be and their experiencing of what we could call the event or God in some sense. um,
Mhm.
so yeah, I'll pass it on to you, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks for reaching out. Is the first person that's reached out to me, so I feel honored. And you said thanks for the special guest, and the first thing I looked at was your cat. So I want to give credit to the cat sitting on the sofa. No, it's a nice pleasure. And but when I got your email through, it was nihilism and religion, which is a theme that came up with Cadell. I think because it's a theme that has come up in my own work from before the university, through the university, and even today. Because, like you said, the question of what we've called negation of the negation, which Cadell kindly introduced into that conversation before, um, and how this relate. Like, so again, like I think it'd be nice to introduce what negation of the negation means. And after watching a few of your videos, like we've said before this conversation, um, the negation of the negation says something about nihilism and something about mysticism and something about religion in general, if it ever reaches that point of negation of the negation, which I think is not just pure nihilism, but it also reintroduces a new way to relate to an idea of God or an idea of divinity or an idea of spirituality or an idea of maybe the more um, Eastern perspectives in Taoism and Buddhism of how we relate to what is real in a way, to what there is, to the way. Because for me, basically, what this negation of the negation means is that the very forms, the very framework in which we've experienced the world is also ready to be annihilated. So even like the dichotomy between atheism and being religious, or even the third alternative of agnosticism, those frames themselves are always subject to a type of annihilation where the arguments we typically hear on all sides are kind of questioned. And I think what the question that comes up is always the question of what is the object that we're trying to observe. And again, like all of the objects that we observe in these arguments are always based upon the idea of God as an object that we can know or represent, or for an atheist that we can't know and we can't represent. So the negation of the negation is to kind of like not just draw the carpet out from under God, as Nietzsche did so well, but it's to take away the carpet from the other side, which says that God is dead. So I think, in a way, like, although I didn't explicitly say it, what the death of God means for Nietzsche is the very foundation, well, the very framework for which we needed God was taken away. But that does not deny the possibility of God. It just means that God can be experienced in a different way.
Mm.
And that's what negation of the negation means: is you're not just stopping at the next alternative; you're continuously degrounding. And there's a reason for this, but we can get into this. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's interesting. Like, Nietzsche's notion of the death of God is very fascinating because Buber does this thing. He does like this reversal where actually the death of God actually wouldn't take away the possibility of God, but what actually means is that the death of God actually is our own absence of being, sort of not being present with God, or of that sort.
Okay.
Um, And so this absence that we hold, and I think this is the interesting thing about the annihilating and the negating of the negation, is that the moment that I assert something, that I say something about God, is also the moment that I stop having a sort of type of relation with God. It's kind of like saying, it's kind of like when I call you Thomas, I am instantly saying that I know everything about you. But when I say Thomas, that is only an indicator, a sort of like a beginning of my relationship with you, just a sort of name that I can have some dialogue. Um, but if I'm saying Thomas as if I already know and understand, then I'm already just having a monologue with myself about Thomas.
Yeah, yeah. And this is what annihilation does, is it shows you this process of seeing how every instance in which you think something, nihilism or annihilating, is the moment of hesitancy where you question that ability to know something. So I think with your work, from what I've seen, and the reason why I'm trying to think of the name of the video you've done on the question of the mystic who's aware of negation, specifically in relationship to this idea of becoming, is like, it's the question of why mysticism in this place. Like, why does mysticism also begin in this place? Because if it's nihilism, and nihilism is entering into that perspective where, okay, my name is Thomas, but I become aware of the inability to say that with a type of meaning that lasts throughout time and space, because that's just a name given to me historically. Why mysticism? And I think this is why, when you reached out to me, and from what we've said, and like the emails we've shared, um, I believe that mysticism can only start from that place of annihilating, of nihilism, because it's like an awareness of the hesitancy to know God, label him or it or her, and to theologize, to create systems of understanding that enable us to think what God is, what we are in the world, of our destiny in the future, of our moral status. My understanding of mysticism, and the joy I found in reading Christian mystics, Taoist thinkers, thinkers from Zen Buddhism, and even thinkers who have tried to overlap those distinctions in the first place, is that nihilism always starts from that place of insecurity. So this came up in the conversation with Goodell when I mentioned this Alan Watts, the book The Wisdom of Insecurity, his book Beyond Theology, and some of his work specifically on Zen Buddhism, and even other thinkers. They always start from that place of negativity, nihilism, nothingness. And then you find differences in mysticism, You find some that try to then re-theologize, meaning like to say that nothingness is the only truth. Good mysticism for me is one that wouldn't stop at that point to say, well, God is nothingness, we should just stay within nothingness and not think about anything. A good type of mysticism is aware of what, with this conversation with Cadell, I tried to introduce about this idea of what annihilating means. It doesn't mean letting go of God or letting go of our idea of God. It's about letting it be, and whatever comes to be for us in each and every moment is there to be reinterpreted and interpreted according to our own position in the world, Yeah, so that's what, yeah, I think that's what I found in the videos I've watched from you, and some of the stuff you put on is it Substack?
Yeah, Substack.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. The It was interesting, again, like the mysticism always creates tension with the religious authority, only because it always introduces, like you said, it introduces a new interpretation that the religious authority is always going to be uncomfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
um and
Especially because the interpretation is about nothingness.
hmm,
So like theology stands up on this idea that we can determine something about God, which is the very distinction between each religion, is it has a different something about God,
hmm,
a different path to God, a different way in which we attain a good standing with God. And this is why people, in a way, despise religion, because each religion, and I think this came up in one of your videos, prioritizes its own passage towards what it thinks it should, or what it thinks every human being should be. So that's why religion is always working within this moral framework, because it's trying to teach you the moral standing of how you relate to this thing called God that exists beyond your present moment, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So the type of religion or the type of Christianity that I entered into in my mind when I was 19 was, fortunately for me, a very graceful side of Christianity, which in a way, fortunately, was less religious in that sense, because it was a teaching which said there is no difference between you and God. You don't really need to do anything. It's just maybe better if you have a perspective of what's true. So I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense, you know, like maybe I could try and find out for the first time in my life what is true. Maybe the Christian idea has something to teach me, you know. But then when I went into the church and some of the establishments within the religion, quickly I found that there was these hidden presuppositions about which path you should be taking, what's the next step in your journey. This is what you should do if you want to work through the church and become a pastor or a preacher, you know. And it was at that point that I questioned the ability of religion to take nothingness seriously. So when I then started to question from within the church, like, okay, but what about the grace of God, the love of everybody? What if there is no difference between anybody because of pure differentiality, because everybody's different but loved equally without any judgment? You quickly find that that type of mysticism, because it is a type of mysticism which sees nothing different between anybody, nothing, becomes problematic for the framework in which I would say most religion tries to understand its objectification of God, how it works with the idea of God, you know. Because I think most religion still, unfortunately, works within that framework of theology, which hasn't taken this interpretation of nothingness seriously, which I think mysticism has done for a very long time from within the religions, you know. It's taken nothingness seriously, and even if it's never called it nothingness, if it's called it like openness or emptiness or void or whatever, it's realized that an experience of God can be had because God was always already present, always already without judgment, because judgment was itself a type of human insecurity, you know, where we had to value ourselves according to our own idea of what is good, you know. Again, this is why my Cadell conversation with Cadell was nice, because I think we touched upon this idea of, yeah, what Nietzsche teaches about the inability to value good and evil. And I think that's the place of God, actually. Like
Say that again.
the inability to value good and evil is kind of like the nihilism, not needed, because if it's already here, you don't need it because it is what is. I'm joking. That reminds us that the very moral system we have towards what we think we should do to be right with God is itself an illusion, and it's in the annihilating of that, which is what Christians call grace, because you don't need to do anything, according to some Christians, that you encounter the event of God.
Mm.
And it's there then that perhaps there is some truth to religion.
Mm.
You know? And I think this the reason why I've kind of gone through this is because I wanted to connect it to what you see as the connection between mysticisms. And from your video, what you said is like nihilism as being that kind of connection, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested to, yeah.
Yeah, so actually, I didn't bring this up with you earlier, but
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to this speech by he's one of my favorite mystics, more modern, but he's gone now. Thomas Merton. He did a speech
Okay.
about Buber and Buber's interpretation of the Hasidic tales. Anyways, what's interesting about this notion of the Hasidic tales of Adam and Eve again is that
Mm-hmm.
actually um, he points out that, and this is Thomas Merton pointing it out, that actually Adam was already doing good, but he wanted to know that he was doing good. So that like that is like the simple like paradox that Adam and this reinterpretation of Hasidic tales and sort of explanation by Buber with the
Mm-hmm.
commentary of Thomas Merton is you see that Adam was already doing good, but he wanted to know that he was doing good. And this is the trap, right? This is the trap that we get caught up in. And this is why I love the line that you keep saying, that, it's this becoming of what we already are.
That's I don't believe in our ability to know prehistoric life. I believe in evolutionary theory. I'm very irreligious in that respect. I also believe there's power to myths, and I believe that there are many interpretations of Adam and Eve which have spoken to me in different ways, but one was very similar to what you've just said. The idea that, and I think I've made a note on this when reading Nietzsche, when Nietzsche talks about like the possible experience that we as human beings can have beyond good and evil. I think I made a note saying like Eden with a question mark, because Eden was the place where there was no knowing of good and evil, like not even a slightest inclination about what we should value as being right or good or beneficial, or like there was no framework in which that was a possibility. Adam and Eve were naked. As soon as they ate the apple, they saw God in the garden, and they pulled up the leaves to cover their genitals because they felt naked. And the first question by God is, why are you hiding yourselves? And they said, because we're naked. I remember there was a really interesting class when I was doing my law degree. There was this amazing teacher who made a reference talking about law's relationship to mythology and how law developed as an idea, saying that law, and you can think about Christian law or just law in general, and then law connected to morality. Law is the idea that the way we are already has some kind of lack in terms of like good or bad behavior. So we need law to govern that behavior. So of course, in like a society, that kind of makes sense because you look around and you see people doing bad stuff. But in terms of this initial myth, it shows you that we thought we had to have some kind of knowledge of good and evil, and so law imposed upon us, which is the beginning of religion maybe, to then have a correct relationship with God. The myth of Eden, in a way, is like before this knowledge, before this abstraction, and I use the word abstraction lightly, but before this knowing, we were able to live. And of course, by the way, this is all a myth. I don't want to make it sound like I'm we had a relationship to our existence, to being, to our moment, to the now, where we didn't have to perceive good or evil to be able to flow with what is, And I think this is a way of like trying to point ourselves towards what Nietzsche understands as the overman, the overwoman, where morality is not a question because the way in which we can relate to life is itself, a dance, a movement, a joy, a peace. Yeah, so that's something that I think about actually occasionally.
And that's actually what I found interesting about like Nietzsche's kind of metamorphoses of the child. There's something very, especially when you read Rumi. Rumi is one of my favorites to read, and he always has like this childlike way of like telling stories, and even like the teachers in the stories behave very childish when like there's somebody that always approaches the guy with like a very serious question. But I think the child is actually the very embodiment of negation, meaning like we were once a child, but to become once again what we were, it is this process of realizing that actually there is none of this knowing of good and evil. And I think even in a real childlike experience, you don't really like when you're first born as a child, you don't really have that sort of acquaintance with good and evil until actually something happens, till you're sort of taught that what you're doing is wrong and what you're doing is good.
Psychoanalytical theory, what I know of it, mainly through Zizek and other thinkers, more contemporary thinkers, is that during the developmental years, we do encounter the law. So like even psychoanalytical theory talks about the law, the father figure, the sense of authority that we encounter in society where we are told that we should or we ought to do things. We're told that we shouldn't, we should not do this because it has an effect on this. And we learn and we process things. Of course, like to a certain extent, that's good. Like we learn that there are certain behaviors within society. But I think at an individual level, we're introduced to the idea of we're introduced to the idea that there are many objects that we can and can't achieve. There are many objects that we can and can't approach or do. Don't do this, do this. I think it's in this education that we start to find anxiety, that we start to find lack, that we start to find kind of different desires. For them, then we aim for objects just purely to aim for them because the father figure says you should aim for this. You should marry this particular type of person. You should aim for this particular type of job. And I think this has a very interesting connection between nihilism, but also law and religion, because of course religion is there to frame your desire. It's there to frame your existence, not because of the thing itself or because of the potential experience that you can have in life, but because of this idea that you should do it because there's some higher reason. And again, Nietzsche does a good job of coming in to show you that this whole framework is itself nihilistic, which for a religious person sounds like, to go back to what you said kind of at the beginning with particular interpretations, and then you can say around nothingness, seems so disruptive to religion because you're disrupting the very frameworks that enable them to exist as a moral framework. But I think, and if you look at the history of the early church, the first 80, 90 years, there was a sense of community that kind of looks like a communist revolution, where it's really, of course, for the books I've read, I wasn't there, unfortunately, but, like through participating in a social movement where the things that you're looking for are not like postponed for the future, but you're looking at your situation and the oppression you find in the moment and the message that you think you have in that moment, but unfortunately religion seems to be, there's a reason why I love the church, because it just so opposed to what I saw and see as the possible nihilistic reading, which relates to mysticism, according.
Yeah, I encountered the nihilism very early on when I was like rediscovering religion again, and mainly the frustration was for me was when you try to answer that one question, which one is the correct religion, it literally throws you, and at least for me it did, it throws you into like some annihilating experience because for me, because I read philosophy as well, is that every time someone gives me a sort of methodology and saying, well, here's the propositions about why this religion is true, I always ask myself, well, yeah, that's presupposing that your methodology is correct, right? You always have a sort of method to your propositions and the way you discern truth. So, and the only reason why you're having a sort of disagreement with the other religion is because they have a different methodology for their notion of truth. And so you believe yourself to be the sole proprietor of truth. And again, this is what I love about Buber, is that Buber, and we talked about this earlier, Buber actually says, look, between the atheist and the religious man is almost like no difference, because the atheist and the religious man is both making the truth as an object, right? God becomes an object for the religious man, which means he's no different from the atheist in this case. He's still in this I and it relationship, not I and thou.
Which connects to a key theme that threads through the thinkers that I like as well, in what like some of them would call the critique of metaphysics in general. So actually Heidegger says that another way to describe the word metaphysics, which is the idea of any theory which attempts to understand what being is in relationship to beings, things, people, places, etc., is what he calls ontotheology, which means which is what religion is for him. So he would say Christianity is the highest form of metaphysics, in the sense that what it does is it tries to inframe the world with meaning, and it tries to place beings, meaning human beings, animals, things, objects, and ideas, into a structure, and then give that meaning in this life and beyond life. I would say good philosophy since 600 years has done a very good job of making us skeptical about those frameworks, especially because they go into certain beliefs without questioning how they know things. Where did they get that knowledge from? And I think this is why philosophy is dangerous, because if you have like a religious experience or a mystical experience, philosophy could seem as quickly closing down any type of even the question of God. Like, for a lot of people I know who today are very good philosophers, they would just say, well, God's like, same as the question of being, like, it's not relevant, like we don't need it, because we know that question itself only arises based upon like initial presuppositions, meaning like the question of God is only there because of history.
Mm-hmm.
The question of God is only there because we believed in it before, but now today, because we can think speculatively and scientifically, that question itself is irrelevant. But I would say, and this is why Heidegger's good, because he's never dismissing any question, he just wants to reframe that question. So you could say, like, with movements that I became interested in, with negative theology and radical theology, they are contemporary attempts to understand philosophy alongside religion, that take, for example, like a lot of radical theology starts from what they call themselves like the death of God theologies. So there's a guy called John Caputo who is connected to
Mm-hmm.
postmodern philosophy, who's connected to the guy that I study, Gianni Vattimo, who I think one of his most recent books is called After the Death of God. Is that recent? Maybe 10 years old, but he wrote a section just after John Caputo on what the death of God means for contemporary philosophy and contemporary theology. And they try to deal with all of these problems about skepticism, nihilism, postmodern relativism, contingency, all the things that like make thinking doubt itself.
Mm.
And I mean, that's what's interested me the most, actually, is the question of how we can think as least dogmatically as possible by taking contemporary philosophy seriously. I think, which is why I've dealt with nihilism for the years that I have, because I felt like, well, if I do want to think about my relationship to life, to God, and to maybe truth, I should always be aware at least of nihilism as a fundamental problem.
Mm.
But this is I think why this conversation excited me when you emailed me, because I don't think I did the best job with Cadell, but what negation of negation means, in my opinion, is the moment in our existence where what seemed like just the death of God becomes, even Cadell said this himself, the rebirth of God.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could even say that perhaps like the rebirth of truth, in a way, which for a postmodern thinker is like the last thing you would expect, because maybe within postmodern thinking there is a possibility to see how this negation of the negation doesn't look to like the object of truth as if you can know it, but maybe to an event of truth, which for the mystic is what everything is all about. It's about the event, about your experience of God. So yeah, in a way, I think maybe just in this conversation, it might be good if we can really draw out what negation of the negation means, because of course it's a Hegelian concept, and I think with Hegel it came out the first time, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Heidegger gives big enough credit to Hegel for this. But I would say Heidegger work does the same thing, where we realize that, oh God, and even now, like, I'm trying to think about how best to frame it. If I want to affirm something in life, I have to realize that there is a failure. Like, if I want to say God is good, I have to realize with today's philosophy that I can't do this without sounding dogmatic, because you could come along and say, well, how do you know this? And I say, well, faith. And you say, yeah, okay, but that's not good. And I would say, yeah, it's not good. But then I would say, well, perhaps when there is that failure, in the failure of that statement or idea, I catch myself in the event where I can continue thinking, and things are let be for me. So even if then I can never truly determine whether God is good, in the event where there's a failure, I can have the experience of something,
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is what mysticism really draws itself onto, which is why, like in meditative prayer, it's about, okay, for some mystics, it's about constantly letting go of your idea towards what things are and trying to find nothingness. But I think for a good mystic, in my opinion, it's about realizing that you don't even need to do that because everything is always already released. That then you're encountering what God is, which includes your thinking. And that experience is very peaceful and very fulfilling, but not because you've attained a correct idea of something, but because that there's just an event which is releasing. And then
Mm-hmm.
I think from that moment you could maybe dare risk saying, "Oh, God is good." But of course, the word God that you've used is based upon your culture, language, and place. And of course, good does not always feel good because if you have a bad experience, you know,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think the negation of negation, I think, really roots from, like you said, kind of being in this awareness of the failure itself, like
Mhm.
knowing that it fails. But the thing is, like, the affirmation comes in the negation of negation. Once you realize that actually this failure is like necessary, this failure is absolutely necessary. It is a necessity. If I were to sort of reinterpret religion again in a sort of mystical way, I would say that every law, every tradition is only to prepare you for this failure. It's
Yeah,
actually,
yeah.
it's the whole point, right? Because when you realize, I mean, think about the commandments themselves, right? Like, you have to like love your neighbor and all this stuff. Like when you realize, you're like, oh, this is impossible. Like
Hmm.
there's some aspects of all the commandments that actually are on the verge of impossibility.
Hmm.
But once you realize that failure, right? And you could say even Buber uh, acknowledges to some extent that actually God Himself would actually be that failure. When you sort of face that failure, you begin to affirm and are able to sort of actually love your neighbor. Like,
That's yeah, yeah. Wow, that's yeah. The way you've said that's very nice because I think in a way, like to go back to the myth of Christianity, this is what the teaching of Christ says was he came to the Judaic religion that he was a part of to say uh, we're all failing. Well, all of you are failing in the law that you think you're fulfilling and keeping, and this is creating hypocrisy, violence, separation, distinctions. So then, when they went to stone the prostitute, he said, "Well, for you who is without sin, please throw the first stone." And they became self-aware that they couldn't even follow the law. So like the law was purely there to show every single person that if you tried to attain a complete fulfilled being, human being, by following some abstract law, you're always deemed to fail. So there's the negation. Like you encounter this pure failure. And then of course there were I think in again I'm thinking from a Christian perspective, there were the stories where the Jews would say, "Well, if that's the case, how can I ever go to heaven?" And it's in that moment when they rid themselves of this desire to fulfill themselves that then there was an awareness of, "Oh, I don't need to," and then that created the Good Samaritan. Then that created a type of behavior which was peace, love, patience, kindness. And
mhm.
I think in a way the biggest perversion of religion and the the reason why religion is perverse in many ways, like why you find hypocrisy in the church, like that was one of the biggest things I found when I first entered the church. All smiles and good behavior, homeless shelter, and like everything was structured in a very nice way, but when it came down to like the daily level um welcoming of people, there was always like this resentment. There was always this hesitancy, there was always this skepticism, until you found somebody who wasn't aiming for doing something to do it for a good reason. They were just genuinely aware of the fact that everybody is God. They were buzzed. They were walking around. They were loving people without any kind of intention, because they weren't trying to do it to fulfill some kind of abstract law. They were doing it because they saw, in a very Taoist way, in a very Buddhist way, that, or in even Hindu way, I think there's a saying in Hinduism where thou art that and I don't know, like you are it.
Mhm.
Everybody is like everybody is God, to use like the Christian interpretation. And then that's when the good behavior kicks in, whatever good is, you know. Or in the sense, you could say that's when you love somebody because you're not trying to do it with an intention. So I agree. Like I think even today, my reading of Christ is the most fun. And like people disagree with this, but Christ is like the biggest nihilist of all. Like he came and literally died to show the law, the framework of Judaism and Christianity as it is today, that we as human beings can never fulfill this abstract knowing of good and evil and try to strive towards good. And it's in that failure that then we encounter the fact that we are always already divine. So there's a nice, like, I don't read the Bible anymore, but there's one translation towards the end where I found it so beautiful. It's called the Mirror Bible, and it's like it's a translation, but it's kind of the exactly theologian, the preacher who wrote this book. He has a lot of his notes around each excerpt, so like when he translates this, and it's literally pure grace. It's literally like the way he translates the text is to say the original message was, we are all already made in the image of God. There is nothing wrong with us at all. We don't need to achieve anything. And it's in that recognition that we become who we are, you know?
Mhm.
And literally that's it. That's what Christianity is for him. Then you can become a Christian by recognizing this, but it doesn't change your status, you know? And I think that's, if I call myself a Christian, it would be in that avenue of thinking. But then I also find in philosophy and in other, I say like Eastern philosophies, the same message, you know?
Mhm.
And I think this is why it connects to nihilism, because, or nihilism comes in maybe because you don't need to attain the object. You don't need to, like, religion is based upon the idea that you have to achieve something, i.e., righteousness. I think nihilism, and I think what mysticism teaches us, is you can achieve nothingness, you know, by not having to, by literally being aware that you don't need to achieve anything because you are already where you are in the now. You are the overman. You are beautiful. You are kind, you know, and
Mhm.
then you can cultivate that. So of course, like people today in this world aren't kind. We're destroying the planet as human beings. We're not doing good things in society. But I think it's because people live in their head and they objectify themselves, they objectify others, you know. So they're not being nihilistic. They're not being um, aware of the fact that they don't need to do anything, you know.
Mhm.
And I think that's what maybe I saw in the videos that I've seen with you, is what you've seen with this negation of the negation is like there's this moment where you're just continuously degrounding this idea that we have to achieve something. That's
Mhm.
why mysticism seems mystical, because it seems to like pull itself away from the world. But I would say it only seems like that because it's just recognizing that it doesn't need to achieve the world. It doesn't need to achieve things in the same way that the established religion does, you know, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, a famous like statement came to my mind that actually you talking about it sort of gave a deeper, a more depth to it. Like for example, that famous line of like knowing myself is knowing God, and knowing God is knowing myself.
Mm-hmm.
There is something annihilating about that idea, only because I can never like truly know myself the way that I think that I know myself, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And so that in that sense, I also know God when I acknowledge this sort of failure. You know, and
Yeah.
that's like a very beautiful concept about what you're talking about here.
Hmm. I mean, that's when the meditative side comes into it. I think that's what meditation, in a way, tries to achieve. I think meditation that sets itself up to say, okay, I'm going to meditate to explore myself. I think they'll always encounter a type of failure, but in a way, that was the object, which is good to encounter.
Mhm.
Because then in the failure, we have the negation of the negation. Because okay, maybe this is a good way to explore negation of the negation. In meditation, I tried to discover who I am. I want to encounter myself. I want to be self-aware. We meditate and we hear nothing, we see nothing, we think nothing. Like and we say, oh, who am I? Then the anxiety kicks in a little bit and you're like, oh shit, there's nothing here to know. I think, and there's a failure, and that in a way is what negation is. What we thought was something is no longer what we thought it was, and it's negated. That's nihilism in a way. And this is maybe a good time to describe negation. Negation of the negation is where even the nothingness, which then I think I might be, like, because if I try to find myself and I find nothingness, negative nihilism, which is a type of nihilism which is pessimistic, will stop there and say, oh, I'm just nothingness. That's all there is. That's the end of the world. There's no point doing anything. The negation of the negation comes in to say, well, even this nothingness that I think I now am is also ready to be annihilated and taken away towards what? And that's the question, because then I think that's when we can encounter an event and we encounter the continuation of things as they appear for us. Because then I might continue on with my daily business and go around and see things and participate with people. But I think it's in that negation of the negation where mysticism comes in, because I don't go to characterize that nothingness as negative, because I see how even that characterization is itself subject to nihilism or negation or annihilating or releasement, And I think that's when God comes in for me, is it's that letting go. So that goes back to what you said. It's like I am God. Like if I think about me, I encounter God. When I think about God, I encounter me, but not as objects and subjects and ideas, but as the very process of like constantly unraveling these ideas that I thought I could know God, that I could propose a theology. I think that's what mysticism is for me. I think Alan Watts is somebody who really plays with this.
I think Alan Watts, he was actually one of my first introductions to, I didn't even know it. He was one of my first introductions to like philosophy before I really got into religion. But
I
I
would
think,
say same, by the way, actually.
and I think what's kind of unfortunate about Alan Watts is that, at least it seems in my opinion, that Alan Watts is sort of not taken seriously in more like just talk about maybe the academic realms or so on. Because it does seem like Alan Watts is sort of popular within maybe, I hate saying this word, like new age spirituality.
Yeah, like that's the movement he himself was involved with for a short period of time as well. And I think then, even then, he kind of disassociated himself a little bit, probably for the same reasons why people don't like him now, who do read philosophy. And like even for me, I stopped reading him as much. But then, like when I've gone back to read some of his texts, he hasn't got that philosophical framework that we're used to with like contemporary philosophers who I think in a way is quite refreshing. And of course, sometimes it means he's not as specific on particular problematics with what he's saying. For example, nihilism. Maybe he doesn't take nihilism seriously. Maybe he doesn't take Heidegger's criticism of metaphysics seriously. But I think in terms of thinking about the inability to determine what God is, the way he speaks about it, and the joy that he gets to, and the non-seriousness about it, I think for most people that I know, I bought this book. What book have I bought? I think for like 4 friends the last 6 years, I bought this for their birthday, even recently, even last year, because I think it's a book which allows people to even understand maybe what negation of the negation is without knowing it. Just the type of thinking which doesn't read nothingness as like a negative thing, but as like a emancipatory thing to realize that you don't need to do anything. So a selection of essays that he done, the title of the selection is Become Who You Are. And I'm sure from my reading that he's never read Nietzsche. I'm sure he would have mentioned it, because he mentions Wittgenstein, he mentions a couple of others, but his book was called Become What You Are. Because he had that same idea of you don't need to become anything because you are already where you are, what you are. And in a way, he becomes like a pragmatist, because he says, well, yeah, we do think, but those thoughts that we have can either be productive or unproductive for affirming. See, it's very Nietzschean, affirming where we are. And maybe he was influenced by Nietzsche, but then maybe Nietzsche was influenced by Eastern philosophy,
Yeah.
Heidegger as well. Maybe Hegel was. Maybe Christ was.
Yeah. This idea of like the nothing as not negative, but something that is, you find something positive in the sense that it is this letting, this
Mm.
letting. I do find it like it's almost like it reminds me of this book called God is a Verb, where the rabbi takes being as be hyphen ing. And that way you understand that being is sort of like this process, this continual becoming.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this nothingness, this letting, is actually what it means to be in terms of being. Like you
Mm-hmm.
already are who you are. And so there's
Mm-hmm.
this being. I even like Johannes says, I don't know if you know him. He's like a scholar on Heidegger on YouTube. He's independent, but he always, instead of saying being in the world, he says that that's a very like wrong. He doesn't like that framing. He likes in the world being instead, which is for him a much more colorful sort of understanding of what
Mm-hmm.
Heidegger is trying to say. But
Mm-hmm.
I do
Yeah,
like,
that's a nice. Mm.
yeah, I do like that idea. And the other thing that I want to bring about, like I was reading Huxley's notion of perennial philosophy. And he
Mm-hmm.
actually says that there's a couple quotes that he shares between, the Eastern side and the Western side, is that heaven and hell are the same passageway. and,
Mm-hmm.
and I found that fascinating because actually in Huxley's commentary of all these mystics within perennial philosophy, he says that actually going to heaven, like the aiming of going to heaven, is at best what he calls survival. It is just survival. It is not actually salvation. Um, it seems
Mm-hmm.
like for Huxley and these other mystics that actually salvation is beyond heaven and hell dichotomy,
Mm.
right? So in that sense, it kind of goes back to like this second paradise or second of what Adam and Eve were in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that it actually is already beyond good and evil, beyond heaven and hell, in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, already becoming what you already were. Um,
Well, yeah, maybe the biggest. I think like a good Christian reading is to say that the biggest delusion or the only delusion was the idea that we ever left Eden in the first place. Like in a sense, like we've always already been here. Nothing's actually changed apart from. So like in the scriptures when they talk about being banished from Eden, you could say like a reading of Christianity would be that we were banished in our psychology towards where we always still have been. It's just we've become, and again, like this is a reading, like we've lost our way in terms of how we're thinking our being. And I think this is a way to understand like what Heidegger says as being in the world. The world that we are and have been being in are not just world, but worlds, meaning our own subjective experiences of how things are, based upon a type of thinking which has delayed paradise, which has delayed the future communist utopia, which has delayed self-identity to some kind of attainable object when I buy the right product. So we live in this idea of like I'm lacking and I can fulfill myself by attaining an object. Like the Adam and Eve myth. I'm lacking, I'm naked, I now need to clothe myself with the law and attain a righteous standing with God to then encounter my divinity. And I think this idea of like so the same theologian who wrote the Mirror translation of the Bible, the reason why he's called it the Mirror is this is nice actually. He talks about how like religion is like mirror window shopping. So we
mm,
see products in the shop and we realize, oh, there's a difference between where I'm standing now and the products that I'm wanting to buy to attain and then become who I am. The teaching of Christianity and Christ is to show you that we are made. We are made in the like a product. We are made in the image of God. Christ is in us, I am in Christ, there is no difference. So you're encountering yourself in the mirror without you having to do anything. This is very Nietzschean,
Mm-hmm.
in my opinion. And this is why, like, when people say that, like, and even Nietzsche himself, in his posthumous letters, he talks about how his whole work was like still to the end and the type of antichrist. He was the Dionysian who was against the antichrist. But I think his particular reading of Christianity was how Christianity is read by 99.999% of the population, including 99.99% of Christians, as being this kind of difference between where I am and where I ought to be, or where I am and what I ought to believe.
Mm.
Again, and this is the mystical side of Christianity that you can find in the likes of Meister Eckhart and others, where they're not concerned with what you said, like heaven and hell, or they're not concerned with the other world, because maybe they're encountering the very bliss, it's a word that comes up all the time in Christian mysticism, of where we are here and now, without morality, without prejudice, without anything other than the pure love of God,
Mm.
which includes the love of people, because if God is one in this Christian idea, then and again, I think this is what Taoism gets, this is what Zen Buddhism gets, and that's why morality is not found in Taoism or Zen Buddhism in that sense, because, well, it is, again, this is the point. If you look at the practice of it, like, look at the, like, remember in India, like, you see, well, you have the idea of like Hindu philosophy. It's very aware of like the oneness of all things, but then if you look at how it's practiced in the daily routine in India, I have like a friend in the south of India, and I went to visit him, and you see these temples and the segregation between men and women and the hierarchies, and again, like, even the caste system. You see, like, what religion does. It changes maybe the more mystical sides of oneness, pure inclusivity, because of how different everything is, and that's affirmed. Then you have the religion which comes in and tells people, no, you need to do this because of this. You should do this because it's the right thing to do. Then you find perversion. Then you find lack. Then you find, what the Khan calls the Oje Petiya, where you don't even know what you desire, but you desire it because it seems like there's a lack there.
Mm.
And I think that's when perversion does come in, because you're displacing desire, you're transposing desire, and then there's this idea of like the law, and you shouldn't do this, and then and I think that's where, just even psychologically for human beings on a daily level, that's when we start to do things which we don't even enjoy ourselves. And I think this came up in the conversation with Kadao when we talked about food, relationships, and
Yeah, I think what's was a good point about even the Eastern philosophy, and even like the Nietzsche's idea of being like the Antichrist, right? I almost feel like that's actually the embodiment of that phrase of what Buddhists would say: if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha, right? Like, actually, perhaps Christians should be more anti-Christ, and this sort of negation of negation that you sort of play with, where you actually affirm that. Even Young does a little commentary in his Red Book about how actually it is impossible to imitate Christ. It is impossible to sort of be like Christ. But it is when you sort of realize this failure, or this, that you actually become something of that nature. And it also reminds me of this a book that this rabbi came out with years ago. It's called Putting God Second, which is almost, it sounds very heretical for probably any Christian, Jew, or Muslim, or whatever. But actually, I think this sort of putting God second is actually playing the role of like, if you see the Buddha, kill the Buddha. Um, and
Meister Eckhart says the same, and Heidegger following Eckhart,
mhm,
about, even, let's say it in Eckhart's terms, like, and Heidegger follows directly, even the name of God is ready to be like annihilated, even God himself, because that, even in the negation of God, to say I don't need the idea of God, again, like, you don't just fall onto atheism, you fall onto what Eckhart called the Godhead,
Mm.
and what then Heidegger also calls the Godhead, meaning then you encounter the event of God when you let go of the idea of God. So then, like, God is let be when you even let the idea go or be, So this is what the negation of the negation means in exactly the same ways of, like, kill the Buddha.
Yeah,
Because
I
you
think.
shouldn't be aiming to attain this. You shouldn't be aiming to attain the Christ-like nature, because as soon as you do, you are being nihilistic. That's the number one teaching of nihilism. If you're trying to attain the ideal figure of something, even the overman, even this, you're confusing what you should become and what you are already set to become by who you already are.
Hmm.
And I think negation of the negation is just always bringing you back to where your being is now. And then you have the cultivation of your being, Then you have the cultivation maybe of God or your awareness of God.
Mhm. I
It's
think it
very
was.
graceful. Sorry.
I think it was even Saint Augustine that says something like, I pray every day to let go of God. I don't know, maybe if that was Master Eckhart but I think it was Saint Augustine. But
I think it was. Yeah, I think it was.
Buber, and this is kind of, I want to bring in Buber now with his dialogical principle. Actually, a lot of religion, and I think this sort of shows the nihilism within religion, is that all religion is predicated on a sort of event that was dialogical in nature, right? Man
Mm-hmm.
experienced God, God spoke to man. Um, but the funny thing is, you instantly religion becomes like this sort of hunting ghost of what was past, of what was already happened in that dialogical event, because
Mm-hmm.
everything you have structured your religion around is premised off of this relation that one man had with his experience of God,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, you got Muhammad, you got Buddha, you have Jesus Christ, you have Moses, you have all these people,
Mm-hmm.
right? The whole structure of religion is based off of this sort of this relation that appeared. And I think, to sort of go back to what I was mentioning earlier about Heidegger and like his notion of appearance, because I think his definition of appearance can be very useful to sort of understand how religion can already be in this state of nihilism without realizing that they are, is in the sense that the moment, for example, let's take Moses's experience of the burning bush, right? For Heidegger, this is not a showing itself necessarily, but the burning bush is the appearance. It is the announcement of God. And even in the Bible, it says, Moses, I am, Adonai, and so on and stuff like that. So here you understand that actually religion is predicated off of an appearance,
Mm-hmm.
of an announcement, but
Mm-hmm.
in that announcement, there's a showing of itself, which they would term as God, but I reframed it, sort of borrowing from your terminology, as the event, as the sort of annihilating that shows itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I remember reading about this in Heidegger with the idea of an appearance. And I remember going through my uni work and changing why I was calling appearance, like when something appears, and I changed it to like ongoingness, because I realized that Heidegger makes this difference between perhaps like what's happening and then what appears to happen.
mhm.
I think the biggest thing from what you've just said there that draws itself out for me, and I think you made a note of this on something I read of yours on your subtract. Is it what's it called?
It's Substack.
Substack. Yeah, it's good to learn now instead of in 10 years' time. Was you made a distinction that I like to make as well between like the I and the it. So it's like you can even say the distinction between the event of what people would experience as divine, as a divine encounter, as something spiritual, and then the way in which we determine what that thing is, and of how then that's placed into knowing, which then is structured as theology or. And I think that's what I get from what you just said. For me, is the most interesting, because then you can see how there is a dialogical development within human history in how we then go to determine those events. and how those events either relate to an appearance or to truth. So the question is today, in the postmodern, skeptical, nihilistic environment, is how do you, and this is the question of religions and the interconnection between religions, how do you determine what was true from what was determined as something true by a person in their own history, in their own language, in their own place, you know? Yeah. That's the main thing I think that I picked up from this that I find interesting. But when you say, like, because I know you said about the burning bush, and like what you made a connection between like the letting and the event. I think the more mystical side of what Heidegger tries to get to in his later reading as being as letting, lassen, which is what releasement can be translated as, like, in a way. He would say that everything that is let be is not just my attitude towards things as a human being who has the potential just to let things be, like, okay, let it be, that's happened, let it be. It's a way of saying how even things, like, I was on the train the other day and I was caught up in this small passage from Country Path Conversations at the beginning, where he talks about, with the guide, I think I mentioned this to Cadell, there's a conversation between a guide, a scholar, and a scientist, and they're talking about the word technology. And then, like, I think the scholar says, oh yeah, but it just means art. Like, technology, if you go back to the word techne, it means art. And then the guide says, well, maybe there's a meaning which has been hidden because of the way we've used it. And then he goes on to talk about what the word techne means in Greek. And what's really interesting about this word is the beginning part, and I might abuse this a little bit. Tech means the letting present of something. So, like, and I was sitting on a train and somebody walked into the carriage and sat down, and I was like, that's what it means to let be, in a way as well. Like, literally, the person has come into my presence, have been made present, have sat down on the opposite chair, because the seats are kind of like facing each other. And I was like, yeah, that's what it means to be let be, like. And then this is where I think it's quite interesting, which I think might help. The end of the word techne means, in a way, and this is then what technology comes to mean today in modern thinking. Ne is like, in a way, the way we then think towards that appearance, or towards what's now made itself. So when somebody walks on the train and they are let be for me, my subjectivity, although Heidegger wouldn't use this word, start to think about the person, who they are, what they look like, where they're from, the political climate, all this kind of stuff. Like, I frame that according to my subjective position, my mood, my interpretation, my dogmatic, and what I'm trying to say here is, what I find in some mystical philosophy, and especially in Heidegger's later thinking, is how what is true is the fact that when that person came onto the train, it's not just me saying, I'm aware of their coming to be, I can also let them be. What's true about them is that they've been allowed to let be. And that's what being is for Heidegger. It's the very fact, and this makes sense, like, it's the very fact that they've been allowed to be, in a way. Because, and that's what it means to be let. This, I think, is what mysticism is ready to get more of. Is not just to say, okay, it's about me opening myself up to what there is, let things be. It's to see how there's always already a letting happening. Like, the fact that we're allowed, that's a very wrong word to use. The fact that this conversation is happening and it's let happen by its own being, that's mysticism for me. That's the place where I see that in presence, and this goes back to a conversation that I told you I started to watch, we had recently, with I think the wife from OG Rose and the other lady. Very interesting. Um, where there's a problem of presence, like the problem of time and the now, and how can we think about the now? Because then we notice that we're already not in the now because the idea we have is already old.
Mhm.
What's most mystical, and this is what letting means, is okay. I've lost myself a little bit because I'm thinking about presence, or how the fact that the presence of that now, which is now me thinking about it, is let be, meaning like it's
Mhm.
happening, it's gifted, it's there for me to think about, and that creates um where the very problem between my idea of now and now, which is the contradiction, that contradiction disappears because I realize that both are let be, like in the now, which is then now.
Mhm.
Sorry if that's now got very confusing. It's just I
No,
get very
no.
excited when I think about this idea of letting, but it's still, and again, it's still very fresh for me. So
I think what you're getting at kind of reminds me of like Buber's emphasis of like what he calls the living God,
okay.
where it's this it's this fascination of like you can't I think if there's anything close to a living God, it has to be similar to what you're saying about this letting, this letting be. It can't, because the moment you start formulating something that's living, it's
Mm-hmm.
already dead. You've already dissected it. You've already I think I forgot where I read this from, but like the perfect description of anything is always something dead.
Yeah, it's
So
the easiest to
basically,
digest. Yeah.
the mystics in some ways understand this. They attempt to always continue, or you could say they constantly try to turn themselves towards this way of letting, towards this way of a
Mm-hmm.
living God that they they try to always present their whole being, as like Buber says, to present your whole being. That means like let be. You don't hold back anything. You sort of present yourself, your full mortality, your full finitude, and only then possibly you can't do this on your own striving, like Buber says.
Mm-hmm.
Possibly you can encounter a relation with I and thou, not an I and it relationship. Um, and Buber, I think this whole idea of like what does it mean to have like a reliving relation with something, it has to be this letting be. And even if we take dialogue seriously, the very fact of having this exchange, this mutual exchange of listening and speaking, in the moment of my listening, I have to sort of already annihilate everything that I want to say, want to do,
Mm-hmm.
in order to actually listen to what you're saying. So it's like there is this constant mutual exchange, and I think there's a lot to Buber's notion of this dialogical relationship where religion and the mystics, and I think this is why mystics don't even concern themselves with the other religions, right? Because they sort of understand that actually, if you it the other religions are already allowed, as you said, allowed to let be, right? And so when we
Mm-hmm.
try to answer this question of why are they other religions allowed to let be,
Mm-hmm.
well, it is already a granting, a gift, um, that you don't need to do anything about other than let it be.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, which it kind of reminds me of like how Johannes talks about Heidegger's like ecstatic time, that that the coming of the present is always like a gift. It was always, and I absolutely love that notion that Heidegger brought, because I thought that was actually very mystical. That is very like
Exactly.
that you are being granted something. It is not something that I can possess, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the danger, and I think this is why I like Heidegger's notion of a static time, is that actually, if we look at the now as something that is given, that is granted us as a gift,
Mm-hmm.
then we can stray away from the dangerous notion of now, where it's like, okay, I have to try to be in control of the now. I have to try to
Attain
be
it.
present, attain it. Yes. And that's what
Yeah.
I was trying to get at with the talk that I was having earlier with OG Rose's wife, Michelle, and Sanduni, was
Mm-hmm.
that you cannot, you fall into this sort of nihilism when you start trying to strive for the present. Like, I'm going to be present, I'm going to be now. You can't.
Mm-hmm.
The now is gifted to you.
Mm-hmm.
And
Already.
that you can do is
Mm-hmm.
just be. Just
This
let the.
is this is. People think I opt out of difficulty sometimes because they think, you just choose the easy way, to say that you are already present, you don't need to do anything. And I think this is why people, in a way, have they like Alan Watts. I think there's a reason why he's so popular on YouTube. Like when I typed his name in last year, it was like millions and millions of views. A, because his voice is really soothing, and B, because I think what he is talking about is the easiness of which you are already in the present. But I don't think then he's naive where he's saying, okay, maybe let's step away from Alan Watts because maybe in some sense he doesn't go far enough. Yeah, but no, but what you just said there about the fact that the now is not something to be attained, and I think this is again what nihilism teaches us, because there is nothing about time. And if you look at Being and Time by Heidegger, it's not just being and time, it's being, nothing, and time, because being is from the beginning of the text equated to nothingness, and then that's where time comes in. And I think this is why it's a gift, because we don't need to do anything at all in any of our determinations of what there is at all. We don't need to do anything because that is being. I think this is why for Heidegger nothingness is so key, because it brings you back to the fact that nothing needs doing. Like we need to think nothing. Why? Not to attain nothing as if it was a thing to attain, but nothingness is that which constantly problematizes the idea that, I should be present, because even our idea of presence becomes something that we think we need to attain. But then I think the joy is to see how whatever presence is, we are already present. Whatever being is, we are already being. Whatever, and this is the joy of, I think, a lot of mysticism as well, is that, and even Nietzsche as well, is that we do not need to do anything. That's what grace means in Christianity, like radical grace. I think it's called radical grace theology. It's literally sharing this message. Well, a lot of it's very dogmatic because it thinks you will be saved if you know that you don't need to do anything. But I think the most radical version of this is to say it's not even about this idea of being saved, because that very idea functioned within a type of thinking which was nihilistic, meaning like in the dogmatic sense of it was trying to attain something, it was trying to attain salvation. Some radical theology, like the one I mentioned twice now with this Mirror Bible translation, it's saying you do not need to do anything because you are already not something, but literally nothing, meaning God. You are already there. And so the message is not about preaching content. In a way, it's about preaching contentlessness, But that's where then you find yourself present. That's when. So I remember when I was really into this, I felt like when I prayed, it was just like meditative, It was really, like even I was saying, even in the church I was going to at the time, it was like, oh shit, like I need cave time, my time to. And I remember these moments, they're just really, like I didn't need to do anything. There was no reason to do it. I felt good. I wanted to do this, without intention. Whereas normally people pray because they want something, like, I need £50. Let me pray for something. Yeah, but again, by the way, the way you said this about the presence is super, super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because we can't possibly possess the present. I think that's what gets us. And the
That's
same
the way
thing
you said
with
it.
and the same thing with, if we want to talk about religion again, is that this idea of like, and this is where the dogmatics come in, is like where you feel like you need to do something in order to save someone, and in order to save yourself, right? So like when I'm preaching to somebody about a specific religion, I'm trying to save them, and in the essence of saving them, I am attempting to save myself. But actually the anxiety lies in the fact of not you're trying to save them, but in your trying to save yourself, right? So this sort of gets, you could say, projected in
And this
people's
is a this is a sorry, this is a type of selfishness in a way, you know,
Mhm.
because this idea of preaching starts on the premise that there is a self to save. I remember, like, because I had like a bit of anxiety, well, quite strong anxiety when I was 19, a bit of psychosis, and this is why religion became the question, because I questioned my life for the first time. And there was a type of existential anxiety where I was there to rescue myself, you know. So that was my passageway into at least the beginning of religion, was to say, well, how do I ensure that I don't have a similar experience, and how do I ensure that me in my life can attain at least some sense of truth? So then I started to question things, you know. And in a way, it was like the most selfish task. It was about this idea that I need to hold on to my self identity. I need to save it. I need to structure it. I need to make sure that it's safe, because I don't want to fall into nothingness, you know? That was really like my whole padding. Then I felt like I had a mystical experience where the very notion of self just dissipated. It wasn't even part of the equation, you know? Then you go into the church, and then they tell you about improving yourself, becoming Christ-like, becoming righteous. And it was literally like, wow, this is completely the opposite of what I had then experienced before, you know, which was not about selfhood, you know. Like in Hindu philosophy, it was about the selflessness, like to know that you are it already. Like,
Yeah, that's what's interesting about the even idea of like selfhood, or like trying to possess selfhood. I think even the irony about even, I think, some of the interpretations of the mystics that shows like something very paradoxical is like, in the annihilation of your ego, your selfhood, you actually attain a selfhood, and that's like the paradox of it all. But the problem is that you shouldn't be aiming towards a selfhood, right? So it's like this trick, this pragmatic trick, to where the mystic tell you, oh, you need to just annihilate yourself, annihilate yourself, annihilate yourself. But actually, if you were to stop there, then you'd run into a big problem. You'd run into like nihilism and several other problems. But once you realize that in the midst of you annihilating yourself constantly, you actually already have the selfhood. The selfhood is already there.
but this goes back to what you said about morality as well. Like, when you stop trying to be a good person within a certain structure, you can maybe say that you become a good person. Like, if you're not concerned about yourself and you see the divinity of others, then maybe naturally you care about them because of the fact that they are it, you know. And I agree. And I would say, even in psychoanalysis, that's its main lesson, is to say, well, your preoccupation with your ego is destroying you, but then so will your preoccupation to get rid of your ego. That will also destroy you, because you on both sides of that dichotomy, you think that you are the ego that is needs thriving or destroying. Maybe psychoanalysis is there to show you in a very Hegelian way that those two options were illusory, because both base themselves on an idea of self, you know. And then when you don't try to attain either like ego or non-ego, then you could say maybe a type of self comes out, like confidence, less anxiety, aware of your own lack, you know. And I think this is what psychoanalysis does, even with friends of mine who are interested in it, and I've seen like personal development in them, not when they've tried to attain a person, but when they haven't tried to attain it. And I think, again, that kind of connects to releasement, you know, of not striving towards it, and in not striving you encounter it.
I think what's interesting about all this, right, the sort of the failing of the, like, trying to have an ego or not trying to have an ego, is that actually you fall into like what Zizek, when he was doing the interpretation of culture from Lacan's view of this Zeno's paradox, that there's actually no movement. But the failing, and I love his interpretation, Zizek's interpretation of like the story about this man that is trying to, like, I guess, like rid his memories or whatever, and then he tells the man like, okay, I'll be back, and he always promises himself that he'll be back to meet the guy that will vanish his memories. but everything in his life sort of keeps postponing that. And what I love about that whole little section there, in Zizek's book, is that actually in the midst of our striving of anything, it's not about the fulfillment of the desire. That's the really good psychoanalytic point. It's about the fact that we continue to postpone the desire, because actually what we actually want is the continuous circulation of that desire, the continuance of that lack. We want that continuous lack of that which that desire represents. And and I think that is fundamentally, to me, that is actually what love is. Like we don't possess love, so therefore when we are two individuals lacking love, we are always sort of in the ground of love. But in order for us to have any love, there must be like this postponement, this maybe use Heidegger's words, like refraining of concern, to where I allow the let be happen. And that actually now what I am doing is actually I'm circulating love by refraining this. I don't possess it. I don't possess the person. I am letting be. I am just,
That's not the word refraining there as well, because it always brings me back to this idea of like objectifying. And I think the problem with relationships is the routine, the habitualness, the circumstances, and it creates a type of relationship where this refraining, this purposeful refraining is quite hard, because you're embedded in this system, in the world. You're embedded in a desire which is quickly satiated, and it's just, whereas again, a very Heideggerian thing is, and this is where openness comes in, is to say, well, in a very pragmatic way, desire can be maximized or utilized for, maximize sounds too utilitarian, but maximized in the sense of postponing and delaying, like, oh, maybe we can wait a bit longer, maybe we can, and I would say that is a type of letting be. It's a type of holding out. So I think before this conversation went live, I mentioned about this because you mentioned about your reading Being in Time, and in the text which came after, What is Metaphysics, Heidegger talks about hanging out in the nothingness, hanging over. And it's like this kind of hanging out, which is like a kind of purposeful anticipation of nothingness, and it's a waiting there. It's a dwelling in this nothingness to see what happens. And I think that even I don't think it's the same text, but Heidegger talks about how we should hang out in subjectivism into the abyss, because that's where the event of being happens. And in terms of what relationships are, maybe it's in the hanging out into the unknown, where then the desire really becomes, open again, especially today where lots of relationships are not as open,
Yeah. I was thinking a little bit more about like if our people watching this, sometimes I get curious about, I know I have some audience members that are young, and they might interpret this as something like dogmatic to enforce on other people, right? Like, oh, you need to let be, you need to sort of let this arising happen. But the moment you do that, right? The moment you do that, you're not letting the letting happen. And that's and that's what I really want people to be careful about. And I think this is why I always like Buber's sort of dialogical relationship, because it does enforce that sort of letting be. Like you can't, for Buber, once the relation of the I thou happens, you can't actually discern like a particularity of sort. You can't be like, oh, this is how it is. All you have is this sort of, Buber says it's not even a content. It's sort of like just a presence, right? And the example that I love is that when he says that he was like looking at like a cat's eyes, and in that very like subtle moment of him like looking into a cat's eyes, he like encountered this presence that was more than what they both were.
Maybe to go back to what we said before, like in letting be, which sounds very intentional and willing, like, okay, I will let it be, which is kind of mistaken in a lot of contemporary philosophy because it presupposes an I, a me, a Thomas, and a will, like a desire that can do something. So in a way, like, letting be is the opposite of desire. Letting be is the opposite of willing. But when you let the cat be to be what it wants to be, and you look at the cat and you see the cat's eyes, I think what happens in that type of willing is you realize that the cat's eyes were always already there, and you're kind of exposed to what there already is let be. And in that sense, what you're doing is nothing, because you're not like seeking out the content of something. You're not trying to attribute the correct value to something. And then maybe to go back to the relationship thing, in letting someone be what they need to be, it sounds like you have to do something. But I think this goes back to what Heidegger says, because Heidegger says that being, or, and I'll say this slowly, being's way to be, like the way to be of being, is releasement. So when you see the cat's eyes being there for you, when you don't objectify them and say, yeah, they're cat's eyes, when you let them be, you see their beingness, you see that they are present there for you. And then maybe you see how that itself is a type of letting be. And in a relationship, when you maybe say to your partner, okay, let's just let this be, let's not objectify this, let's just say, okay, like, whatever our ideas about the situation is, maybe we can just let them be. Then maybe for the first time in a while, you encounter that person in front of you as a being who is present, and all of the things that were disrupting that moment, maybe they are let be, and then you're encountering the very presence of the person you love, and maybe that's where love is reignited, because you see how they are being,
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that's easier said than done, by the way. I've had my fair share of willing, letting be, and then realizing that you still live in a world of desire and ideas. And I think
Yeah.
this is why it's so important to emphasize how it's not always about willing. And I think this is where the mysticism comes in. Maybe this is like the idea of achieving nothingness, is you don't need to achieve even the idea of releasement, because everything is always already released. Like, because the idea that things are things in themselves which are not released is our projection onto things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe the original sin, where we think that we need to do something to be the correct person, or
Yeah, that is actually the first provocation, isn't it, in the myth of Eden? Satan sort of provokes the idea that Adam and Eve need to do something.
mm-hmm,
They need to
mm-hmm,
have the apple so that they can know,
mm-hmm,
even though they already were good. They didn't need to know what was good or what was evil necessarily.
mm-hmm,
Um, yeah, and I think the mystic, and this is why I find Buber so important, because Buber acknowledges that after the event of the I and Thou meeting, it crystallizes, right? It becomes an it. It is inevitable that it becomes an it. It has to become an it, because that way it allows the what he calls the eternal thou to continue on as a butterfly. And I really liked his little poetic sort of notion of like that actually what mystics are doing, and sort of using Buber's language, is actually the mystics are watching the butterfly. They're watching the butterfly.
mm-hmm,
And the problem is that the only thing that you could say that we need to do, which is still really nothing, is just this. I don't even want to, because I don't even think it's the right word for it, but I want to say like this constant turning to where the butterfly is.
mm. Heidegger uses the word turning
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah.
It's a nice word to use, turning.
Mm-hmm.
Because, yeah, in a way, like, and this is interesting. Heidegger says that being has turned itself away from us, And you could even say maybe the butterfly has turned itself away from us because it realizes, okay, I'm joking here, the butterfly realizes that we're not capable of seeing a butterfly as a butterfly. We see it as an insect. We see it as, we objectify things. The way we think about things is we can't let that butterfly be, because we always associate it with a symbol or a name, or but I do think, following Heidegger, there is this turning for us on our behalf, where we can have this I and thou, yeah, by not doing anything. That's I think
Yeah, and I think like the paradox here that as I started thinking more about like this not doing anything is actually that every time we do something, we're not presenting our whole being, and that's the problem. We're not, and this is what I'm taking this solely from Buber, where he talks about actually, in order for the possibility, and of course it's not from our own striving, for the I and thou relationship to sort of arise, it means we have to sort of present ourselves with our whole being. But it seems that every time that I'm trying to do something particular, this wanting, this desire, I'm only a sort of presenting a part of my being and never the fullness of my being.
But
And
maybe, okay, I have something maybe.
yeah,
But
go ahead.
maybe if our being is nothing,
Hmm.
the being that we should present is nothingness.
Hmm.
And then when we present nothingness to the butterfly, we also see the nothingness of the butterfly. And then we realize there's nothing to do, and then the butterfly can just be. But of course, I am aware that when we think of our past, of our moment, of our future, we have our own being, like my history, my present, my future, my subjective experience. But I think what nihilism might teach us, to complement what you said about Buber, the idea is that I present the fact that in all of my ideas about myself, there is nothing, like there's nothing substantial to that anymore in this moment. And maybe that presentation, maybe that attempt of nihilism to present myself to nothingness, it doesn't negate and destroy all of my subjective experiences. And this is very Heideggerian. It continues in what I said about the train before. Like, somebody walks onto the train and they present themselves for me. A butterfly comes into the train and it presents itself for me. Heidegger's not negating our own subjective experience in anything. He's saying that there's no difference between the letting be of the thing and my experience of it, because, and this is what he calls trans appropriation. It's not just me appropriating something, or when I say appropriating, he sees it as like taking in, like an experience of. He would say everything's always interconnected. He calls like the very idea of thinking, he finds the root word of gathering. So when something comes into the train with me, a butterfly or a person, what is thinking for Heidegger is the gathering of ideas that happens with that making present. And so there's no disconnection between my thinking of something and the thing itself. This is why he sees it. He calls it like the one fold of the fourfold, the oneness of the fourfold. Very mystical, And maybe this is really connected to now what you said between the I and the Tao. Like, you see that even the very distinction between the I and the Tao is kind of unproblematized, because you see how, and this in a way relates to what I was speaking with Cadell, like overcoming nihilism in a way is just to have a different attitude towards what seems to be a failure, because what did fail was a type of thinking which tried to just simply objectify a thing as butterfly, insect, a lower species than human beings, which is how we quickly associate things,
Yeah, the play on the nothingness and the whole being was, I want to say that actually the sort of the presenting of the nothingness was the presenting of the whole being. you know,
There you
like
go.
that's exactly what I was trying to say in that moment, because like that's why I loved it. And that's why, when we sort of striving, this sort of doing, um that's when we sort of fall into the it relationship, like Buber talks about. But the it and the thou. Buber talks about how sort of fluctuating it is, how it just they both fold into and onto each other. Um,
I
and
really need to read. Like, as you were talking about this, I opened up and he has his book I and Thou. That's what you would recommend, yeah?
yeah, and actually, so the I and thou is very poetic. I very much love what Buber says. But then there's between man and man, which is
Hmm.
like Buber's more like you could say a better explication of what actually the having dialogue actually means.
Okay.
But it would seem like actually, and I think to sort of root back what you're talking about with Heidegger's like you don't need to sort of dismiss your subjectivity.
Hmm.
I think this is actually, and this is why I keep bringing. I'm really trying to sort of mesh Buber in here with Heidegger,
Well, they
meshing the
sound really,
subjectivity, huh?
they sound really overlapping.
Yeah,
So,
they do. Um, Meshing your subjectivity would be like actually, or not dismissing your subjectivity, but holding on still to your subjectivity. I think has to be in the sense of a dialogue,
mm,
right? It's only in the sense of monologue where the subjectivity becomes possessive and overpowering and claims
mhm,
to have this sort of framework. But
mm,
it doesn't realize within its own subjectivity that it is subjectivizing already a framework.
mm.
you know.
Well, yeah, maybe the like following something, because maybe what subjectivity is in a very common sense daily way is purely the framework itself in which we understand the world around us.
Mhm.
The way we so like the subject is always barred, it's always lacking, but it's the very mechanism in which then we go to make sense of our experience, you know. And I think this is why there's always like this lack in psychoanalysis, because when we then go to seek ourselves, we just find nothingness. So maybe psychoanalysis is just literally the procedure in which we can confront that nothingness within what we thought was subjectivity. But then, like you said, interestingly, maybe it's when we negate that subjectivity that then we can encounter what we can call subjectivity, you know, but like
Mhm.
different. And I think this is what Hegel does so well with you pass through the notion of something, you pass through the notion's failure. So the biggest example that I truly understood was nature.
Mhm.
You have the idea of nature, you know, like which is normally like other than the city. Oh, I've gone into nature. Okay, like, but then like, you could say, well, maybe the distinction in the first place was a bit problematic. So you see how that word itself, the notion, the concept, always encounters its own impossibility because you line it up with non-natural or non-nature, and you find nothingness, and then you find like this failure. But in the failure, and even Hegel talks about this, you encounter this releasement of the concept into itself. Um, and this is very hard to describe, but it relates to what I tried to say with Cadell about becoming. In the failure of the notion of nature, I encounter nature as the very thing which enabled that notion to be formed in the first place, because nature is literally like, you know, the bodily thing that enabled that concept to be in nature itself, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, no, that makes sense. I
Like
mean,
being is being, and even the word becoming. So like these words like being, releasement, um, becoming, all relate to are all abstractions that fail, but maybe they are, and this is where Greek, this is why Heidegger does kind of move back to Greek philosophy, because maybe Greek philosophy saw how even in the failure of the notion, what it was pointing towards was event like, was present, not as a notion, but as a type of environment. Like, well, yeah. And this is where mysticism comes in, because it says you can't talk about it, but you can experience it, you know?
mhm. I,
Yeah.
this failure of the notion is like it's so hard to explain to people. I would say. I mean,
Mm,
in the midst of our talking, I understand what you're talking about.
mm,
But like if we're talking about just sort of everyday people to sort of
mhm,
explain the failure of the notion, is very difficult. And I've always tried to find ways and how to explaining that. But obviously, here in the midst of explaining the failure of the notion, you can already see their anxiety about, well, but this is certain. This is sort of rigorous, peer-reviewed research and sort of this ground of certainty that the moment you introduce this notion of failure of any concept, it sort of just shakes the ground of every human being that you encounter, and it's very difficult to. I think I've almost even, and maybe I'm digressing, but I'm almost even have refrained from like trying to expose this to people on like like willingly. And I think this is where I encountered even like my own failure of the notion itself as I am trying to sort of explain the failure. Um, that and this is again, Buber talks about something of the sort of like your concern shouldn't be about theirs, what their thou is or what they're doing. Your only concern should be what you're doing, what your thou is. And this sort of like shattered the realms for me because in the essence of me embodying like the failure of the notion, um, it sort of enriches or changes the relationship that you have with other people. And in that sense, you're already telling them about the failure of the notion just by being that failure of the notion. And I think that that is what a good mystic to me is, right? They sort of embody that failure of that notion because they are not concerned. And it's very hard for me to find a mystic that is really concerned about like the other religions. That's the fascinating thing about the mystics is they're not often very concerned about what is the objectification that is going on. They are primarily concerned with their constant turning towards God, right? Just to sort of put a mystical language on it, they're constantly just trying to turn themselves towards God. So they have to be in this constant failure of notion in order to have a relationship. And I think that's the key about the notion is that the moment you say what nature is also at the same time the moment you refuse to have a relationship with it. And
Because
that's
it's
the
brought
problem.
in the notion.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting observation. Yeah, I think this is why, like you said, like Alan Watts doesn't come across as being serious because I think he's so unconcerned with the failure of our thinking to think things properly, because he's on like the other side of what he sees as like the joy of what he now thinks thinking can be for us. That in his life and his presence and his joy, you can see a different way of being where when you listen to him or read his books, which like obviously a lot of people do, that itself is enough to ask a question like, well, how is he viewing the world that enables him to have this joy in relationship to the world? And then you see that his entire experience of the world compared to our common sense, our daily common sense is itself entirely different, So I agree, like mystics like Krishnamurti, where his whole presence, the way in which he participated in thinking, I think that's enough, Like Nietzsche's Overman is kind of a teaching, it's an advocate, but I don't think he's laying out a rule book on how to become. I think he's just allowing you to see a different perspective that's made possible in the world, which then I think opens up the critique of our common sense everyday thinking. And I think that's the place of philosophy in a way, is just to show you that the very framework in which you've been thinking things is ready for a critique.
Mhm.
Like that's maybe what philosophy does. It just makes you question the basic, and it sounds very philosophical, the basic, I could say this in a really philosophical way, the basic axiomatic presuppositions that you have, i.e., in other words, just the very common sense way that we approach life.
Mhm.
The presupposition means like the things that we take into our view of the world, maybe like the unconscious elements, the pre-understanding, like the base, and this is the point. This is why Heidegger's whole work, and I said this to Goodell like 5 times, is a critique of the history of metaphysics. So for someone who's not read philosophy, which is most people, what that means is it's just a critique of the way that we have thought in the West, which is the idea that there is an I, that there is an it. So what I think this failure of thinking is just to say, well, at a very naive level, who am I to think that I am an I? And who am I to think that what I'm calling an it, man, woman, is itself just a man, just a woman, you know? So philosophy is there to say, well, maybe that framework between subject and object is itself framed in a particular way, with a particular intention. So philosophy is that kind of, and that's why philosophy maybe in itself is itself always nihilistic, because it's always questioning what there is, what we call something. And maybe nihilists would just say the reason why it's doing that is because there is nothing. But then maybe good nihilists say, well, even the nothing that you're calling nothing is not really a nothingness. It's just that's the beginning process of a mysticism, which, you know, leads you to a different type of thinking. But yeah, like so I think when a good mystic kind of gets with that on that path of nihilism, depending on where they stop, because some stop at nihilism and become very negative, some stop at reaffirming God as something, or then, you know, when someone witnesses that, then they can say, well, yeah, compared to the thinking that I'm thrown into in this society, maybe there is a different way to think, you know. It then goes back to what you said about like mystics aren't even concerned with other religions because they're so preoccupied with their relationship to what they call God within that experience. And I do think it is God. Of course, that's from my experience. Yeah, like you don't need to preach it, you know, because what you're preaching is not like a new object, you know, because there is no object. Like God isn't an object anymore. God is dead. God is dead in the sense that God as an object is now uncovered as being a lie, an illusion. And maybe that's God's intention, you know, to show us that our objectification of it, is itself just an object that we fabricated and distracted ourselves from our very present being, you know.
I mean, even I mean, you're making good points because, like, if we go back to the mythology again, like Adam and Eve, Satan, even in the Islamic narrative, Satan does this crucial objectification of Adam and Eve. You know, where God is sort of asking him to bow down to Adam, and Satan says, "Why? He is made. I am made of fire, and he is made of dirt, mud, so on." So here you have like this interesting already the I don't want to call it dichotomy, but you have this interesting attitude to where what is evil, you could say, right, is simply the objectification or maybe the soul subjectivity that believes that there is no other room for other subjectivities to exist. In some sense, it's just simply a monologue of this relationship that frames and constructs a framework of reality that they believe to be certain. But the moment you encounter a new subjectivity, right, you get hostile, right? Because what it's doing is that it's showing the anxiety, the groundlessness of your own subjectivity, of your own structure that you have sort of constructed with the world. But what's fascinating about this, and this is what I like about Buber, is that Buber says every time you say I, you're saying it or thou. So it's not I by itself, it's I and it, I and you. It's never I by itself. I can never be for Buber by itself. In that sense, the I can never exist. The I can only become fully more full or more empty by its dialogue, you could say, the exchanges of what happens with them in the world. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so
That's interesting.
yeah.
I think because it relates to this idea that, and again, this is the side of Heidegger that people don't really read, is that Heidegger doesn't, especially when he turns to this mysticism, he doesn't then reject the world or each of our experiences of the world. He says then we have the highest form of care towards
Mhm.
the other,
Mhm.
you know, because we realize in a way that the other was always within the fourfold of our own experience of each other thing, you know. So then we have a concern for the Tao, but in Buber's terms.
Mhm. Yeah, this care is what is important, um, because I think this sort of roots to just very simple messages that Christianity has given, Buddhism has given, but nobody knows how to sort of grapple with such a simplistic message.
Mm-hmm.
um, that actually that it's funny, right? That the idea of loving your neighbor in the Christian sense, right? You don't actually have to do anything, right? This is what we've gotten at. You don't actually have to do anything to
Mm-hmm.
love your neighbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the moment you try to, you already sort of in the attempt, you're already sort of fixating yourself on this idea of what loving your neighbor means.
And then you probably then you find hypocrisy because
Yes, and
maybe
then
the
it's not
Christian is tired because they had a bad day in the office, but they have to do it and they should do it, so they're doing it with a type of resentment. Like, no, really, you see, like
oh, really?
see people like they're dedicating like every weekend at a homeless shelter, but they're bitter because they think like, why is God giving it to me every weekend, you know?
Mhm.
And because they have this sense of obligation, because they really believe that there is a God who is an object, that they are a subject, so they're subject to God, and there is an object as in the person who needs help because they're thrown out of society because of the system, you know.
Mhm.
So but the mindset functions in that way of duty, of ought, should, that what becomes like, that's the thing. I think if you're a good Christian, you need to be a communist in a way, you know, because I think that point where you realize that the subject and object dichotomy falls apart, then you have the openness to question, well, why is that person homeless in the first place, you know? Whereas
Mhm.
if you're caught up in this sense of duty and ethics and like, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, you're so preoccupied with yourself and God, that most of the time you find these people aren't really engaged in the conditions which enabled that person to be homeless in the first place,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. And I think this is why it's the highest form of care to be open, to be
Mhm.
released in that sense, because then you're saying, well, why is this being who is in a world, why is this world placing them in that position where they can't even have a form of shelter, you
Mhm.
know?
I think
Of
the
course, I'm
biggest
generalizing quite a lot here, but
no, it's okay. I think the biggest mistake is that Christianity or the Abrahamic religions have sort of always done this move where God is divine and we're the not of the divine, right? We're the not divine. But I actually think that if we're to sort of like play on Heidegger's like constitution of Dasein, that actually any conception of divineness is actually rooted in Dasein itself. And that would
yeah.
mean that possibly it's because Dasein is already has an element of divineness within itself that allows for the
Mhm.
receptivity of such notions about divine beings,
Mhm.
divine, nothingness, divine anything. Even our notion of something not being divine already shows that we have an idea of divineness. So that, the
Mhm.
way I'm sort of interpreting Heidegger's like constitution of Dasein would mean that actually Dasein, that divine there's a divine element already in Dasein itself, and that allows it to have a sort of everydayness, a
Mhm.
receptivity and understanding of what we call divine and not the divine.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I think some people would say maybe if you read Heidegger in a very strongly historicist way, that's because of the products of the language in which we've been thrown into. But I also think that it can be quite naive, because actually, again, look at Heidegger's later work when he talks about being's way to be as releasement. You can say like Dasein's way to be can be spiritualized, divine, in the sense of having a possible relationship to life where I think even, I don't know if maybe I'm just projecting onto Heidegger. Maybe that's all I ever do, but
The same.
and Zizek talks about this as well. We spiritualize things, we divine things, and maybe you can say we spiritualize things when we allow them to be what they are already spiritualized to be, But the problem with our mindset is we also, what's okay, like reductionism. There's a big thing with me and a couple of friends who might speak soon on reductionism, abstractionism, and of how our thinking reduces events into quick notions. So like this friend, he's interested in like, can we think events in a particular way where we don't reduce them to abstractions, where we just say, yeah, okay, we know that climate change is happening. Oh, okay. Oh, that's not good, And like most of us exist in that mindset. But then if you look, like this week in the UK, it was like 40 degrees. I don't know what that equates to in Celsius, but it's the hottest it's ever been. Like it's crazy, like crazy, crazy, crazy hot. And like I had like 2 days of climate anxiety in a way. And like, of course, that sounds a bit like, but like I felt like, oh shit, like there's an event happening, and the way we're all approaching this is so dogmatic and so objectifying that we just say, yeah, climate change, it's not good. Yeah, yeah. And then we continue, all of us, even if we're like, okay, this is really not good. So there's a type of psychology which is, it's not released. It's not open enough to deal with these challenges, Like Zizek writes about this in the book Living in the End Times. I remember reading this. Like the psychology, the social psychology, and of the human being's experience of events like this, like climate change, the biogenetic revolution, and stuff like this. I recommend it for anyone.
Yeah, even in Looking Awry, the book Looking Awry, that's the only book I have from Zizek. But he talks about nature and talks about how when an event happens, we take this, to use like Lacanian terms, we use this little piece of the real, right? We tend to interpret this piece of the real. And so in the midst of interpreting this piece of the real, maybe a Christian will say like, oh, this is because we've been so sinful, we've neglected God, now there's this punishment and so on. So we're interpreting always, we're interpreting the piece of the real by giving an answer of the real, right? And that, I think that's like the funny thing that Zizek sort of points out, is that actually he's saying that the psychoanalytic way would actually to not interpret, if I understood correctly, to not interpret the piece of the real. And in this case, now you start seeing that there's like this letting happen, where you're not trying to give an interpretation about the event. Because I think, like I think what you're getting at, even with the reductionism, is that the moment you interpret the event, you also reduce the event, right? And then that can become the denial, right? Like, oh, I know this is happening, but
This is the challenge as well, because I think in his book A Girl in a Wired Brain, he talks about hyper objects. I think it's a term coined by this person who's interested in like environmentalism and climate change and everything. So like climate change is a kind of hyper object where it's not just there to be objectified, because it's always obviously more than just data. It's obviously always more than just our concept of it. So climate change is like a slow ongoing process that is literally reframing the whole ground upon which we're standing. And I was reading this, and this is when I was coming through like my postmodern reading for the PhD, and I was like, okay, like I'm really being problematized about how we can think anything. Like this is what postmodern thinking does. It really challenges you to say, well, if everything's an interpretation, then how can we even think about climate change? And I think this is quite important to go through, because then you're saying, well, what is this type of reductive thinking that we have where we try to understand climate change. But of course, there is data. Of course, there is some kind of meaning to climate change where we can say, well, science does a very, very good job of showing that it's happening, you know? And I think this is what my friend Mark, he's from everything we've spoke about, he's interested in is, can we think in obviously a reductive way, but in a reductive way which is not the same as the type of thinking that we're thinking in today, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I forgot the term he used. He was quite clever with what he said, but he wants to try and see if we can think in a particular way. And that maybe goes back to mysticism, to try and connect it there. Like maybe mystics who like to dwell in nothingness and not speak, maybe there's a type of mysticism which tries to speak that experience from within its own tradition anyway, you know? And I think that's what really interests me with the mysticism. And I think I said this to Goodell, like in my Christianity, can I talk about, and I say my Christianity again, the Christianity I've gone through and still hold on to in some respects, can I talk about like the significance of Christ and the myth of Christ and of what that means for our being today, without sounding too dogmatic or without sounding like I've forgotten what nihilism means or postmodern thinking, or, you know, maybe Christ was the original nihilistic postmodern thinker, you know? Maybe.
I mean, that's what I always loved about the stories of Jesus, because all he'd ever pointed out was sort of like the failures, like you said, the failures.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is that I actually wanted to bring this up too, is that Socrates in his dialogues points out the consistent failures. And actually, it took me a long time to understand why I exactly enjoyed that book. Was not that I ended up knowing something about justice or about
Mm-hmm.
law or anything about that, but
Mm-hmm.
just in the exchange of the dialogue, Socrates is always shoving forth the implicit failure of the thought of what you think justice is.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, in some ways, you get an idea of what justice might be just through the negation of everything that Socrates goes through when
Mm-hmm.
someone asserts something about justice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but to go back to this problem of like, obviously, at some point we have to reduce the event, but we don't want to reduce it in the way that we are currently thinking. I think Buber, I think Buber can help here actually, in the sense of that we can reduce the event in terms of a mutual relationship, that actually the reason why we should take nature seriously is not because we have some concept of nature, but because actually it is always an I and thou relationship. It is always I and you, um, and in that sense, it's always going to be a mutual giving relationship. So that means acknowledging the failure will be acknowledging the failure of my mutual relationship with nature, and
Mm-hmm.
now nature is granting as I grant nature as well. Um, I think that if events can become, in a sense, a pure relation, then we can have something that is sort of reductive in the sense of just a mutual relation. Um, but I think anything else possibly gets caught in, because if you allow a mutual relation, you allow for obviously the failure of the notion of whatever you think nature is,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so on. So you allow for this dialogical reduction basically to exist.
Yeah, that's like a type of positive nihilism in a way, you know,
Yeah.
because you're acknowledging failure, but you're saying, well, there still is such a thing as relation, because
Mhm.
even in nihilism, we still relate to things, even if we know that those things, in some respects, have failed.
Yeah.
I like it. Yeah,
You like it?
it's good to encounter a positive. Like that's the thing. Like these last three conversations I've had, because there was also the Q&A. Like my friends are like, "Oh, you're a nihilist," and I'm like, "Well." Like the whole point of nihilism is to say you can't call yourself a nihilist, but I think you're like it's this, and this is what Cadell did a good job, and I think he said, like, I'm gonna say it in a different way, but like in this educational process of existing, like in the big school of life, maybe nihilism is that which is like the most problematic, but it's that bridge to the overman, is to say where nothingness, well, what you've said, like in a very nice way, like the failure of thinking, or the failure of a type of thinking, is what we all at some point or another can possibly go through quite easily, in my opinion, because maybe we just realize that we don't need to do anything, that then we can encounter a different way to be. And that is the big question, a different way to be as human beings who relate to other human beings, but then human beings that also relate to events, and then maybe as human beings that relate to the event, whatever you want to call it, like God or the Tao or life or death, Yeah, maybe not. Maybe we're just projecting.
Well,
What did Albert, one of my friends at uni, he like he's gone back to uni and he was reading Albert Camus, and he was like, he kind of for like a week kept joking about philosophical suicide. So like the Camus idea is like, if you, whatever you project onto being, even nihilism is itself a type of philosophical suicide, because you're trying to conceal the void by abstracting from it. So now whenever I speak to this friend, I always say, Camus would say that that's philosophical suicide,
Yeah.
So that's a very negative form of nihilism, but because then he doesn't realize that what he thinks is being concealed is itself also an abstraction, and that's negation of negation, to say, well, you're not. Yeah. Anyway, I could talk for hours.
Yeah. No, I mean, actually, Camus is the one that sort of propelled me into like whatever idea of God that I have. That's philosophical suicide, right? But it sort of taught me, actually, in my sort of like searching for religion. I explore Islam, and right now I'm exploring Judaism. Is that actually everything has sort of prepared me for a death of God, in the sense of like whatever my idea of God is always dies, because now I'm encountering something that is completely different from my previous encounter of the idea of God. And it has always propelled me. But the thing is, I actually love it so much, this constant dying of whatever idea of God I have, because it actually proves that I'm, in some ways, I feel like I'm actually in a living relationship with God himself, as I'm always encountering this death of God. And I think that's very hard for people to explain, because the moment I start doing this, they're like, "Oh, you're a heretic. You're falling into like
The notion of God is not something that dies, unless you're a Christian mystic, in my opinion, where your whole encounter of God is a constant encounter with the death of God, where Christ dies, and Christ in that sense means logos, the word. The word is always subject to death, and that's where you find a resurrection of the event. See, this is why I still enjoy Christianity more than my subjective experience, but because there are like the myths surrounding Christ. Even Zizek is obsessed with Christ, like this is why, like, a few times there's a nice video with I forgot his name now. This French, I don't know if it's Jean-Luc, the Depuy. Have a look, and anyone who's watching, Depuy, and then type in that, and then Zizek, and there's a little post-conference talk they did in like a back room. I think they did like 3 of them, where like Zizek and him are talking, and this guy says like, why do you not affirm Christianity? Everything in your philosophy is about Christianity. And for the first time I saw Zizek kind of like, oh, actually I'm. But then, of course, when he vocalizes it, he says, well, I'm a Christian atheist. So like, you pass through Christianity as a type of myth, and you come out the other side seeing how there is an open space that we can call the spirit of the community, which, But he's obsessed with Christianity, because, and even in his, if anybody's seen his, the films that he was asked to be in about him, the sublime object of ideology, the perfect guide to cinema. No, wait, the perfect guide to cinema. is the other one called The Pervert's Guide to Ideology or something? I can't remember. In one of these scenes, I'm tired now. In one of these scenes, he talks about Christ and the death of Christ, and I would recommend anyone watching that because there's a myth. There's a myth there, which I think for today's psychology is very powerful.
Mm. Yeah, I've always liked his notion of Christian atheism because it would show like actually like the whole point. This is like a very funny thing, right? Like taking the maxim, right? God is the beginning and the end already shows like how annihilating it is already. And so sort of embodying the concept of like Christian atheist would show like actually you could say Christian is the beginning, but atheism is the end. But then you see it falls onto itself, and atheism is the beginning, and Christianity is the end. And so there's this really like funny like annihilating thing going on, even when we accept the proposition that God is the beginning and the end. If we just simply fold it on that statement, you'd understand like already how annihilating it is, right? Like the moment you conceive of God, it begins and then it ends, and then it
And
begins.
then you maybe find God,
Yeah.
like in the annihilating of the idea of the log. This is very Hegelian. So this is why Hegel was a Christian philosopher in many ways, because he actually spoke about the death of God before Nietzsche did. I would recommend people. There's some nice essays. I think there was one like which compared, and it was kind of like a more traditional reading of Hegel, because I'm more persuaded by Zizek's contemporary reading. But even in this more traditional reading, it looks at the difference between Hegel's death of God and Nietzsche's death of God. And you see that in Hegel, he still makes room for God in the death, because then he talks about spirit. And like even Christ, like Christ dies, and then I think he comes back for a little bit just to say hi to his friends, and the disciple says, like, where are you going? Like, please stay with us, we need you, because we're obsessed with you as the Logos. And then he says, well, if I don't go away, the spirit can't come. And this is the idea of like when the Logos is annihilated, it's then in the annihilation, there's the negation of the negation, there's spirits there, as that which moves, as that which releases, maybe.
I've been wanting to sort of do like a symbolic interpretation of Christianity in terms of like the framework of becoming, because, and actually I got kind of crucified when I did this symbolic interpretation. That actually, if you look at Mary as a symbol of sort of bearing, you could say bearing the word, or the how do I say, the nihility, the nihilism, the annihilating, bearing the annihilating, right? Giving birth to the annihilating. You understand that actually giving birth to the annihilating is something that actually we're very against. And this is why I actually like the notion of like Mary. Mary is actually the embodiment of actually letting be, because in the biblical terms, like God just tells her, like, look, you're going to have a baby. His name's going to be Jesus, and this is going to happen. And she's like, okay. There is something about that bearing of the word that is annihilating, but then the word sort of comes to be, and then it becomes annihilated again, um, and it sort of resurrects itself into something different. And I've always been fascinated about this very specific description of Jesus, and I forget which one of the parts of the Bible it is where they look at Jesus and they notice that actually it's not the same constitution. It's like Jesus is different. Like there's something about his body that is
Shining.
looks the same, but it's different. And and this is what I've always liked about the interpretation of like the eternal Nietzsche's eternal. I'm failing the eternal recurrence, where it's not the eternal recurrence of the same, but it's the eternal recurrence of the like. And I've always liked using Jesus as that symbol of like, actually, this is a very good example of like becoming, because the then resurrection would actually be that you being resurrected would actually be the letting happen, that you let the annihilating sort of take you, and once you let the annihilating take you, it births you a sort of likeness, and then it does it
Mhm.
again and again and again, and it, so on. So resurrection doesn't have to be, and I think this is the part that a lot of philosophers have against Christianity, and maybe how Christians would find I'm like a complete heretic in this sense. But
No, no, it's as Christian as it can be. Like even Christ, what the Christians sing, they say Christ overcame the grave. Maybe that's just a different translation for Christ overcame nihilism. Yeah, maybe because like if he came out of the grave, it shows that he didn't have a negative attitude towards nothingness. He negated nothingness in his resurrection. So
mm,
maybe he was the original.
mm-hmm. uh,
Maybe Nietzsche was wrong.
Buber, what I like about Buber now is that Buber talks about how we shouldn't try to sort of reconcile our contradictions, reconcile the paradoxes.
Mm-hmm.
He says, in fact, the only way that you unite the paradoxes or unite the whatever is actually just by living them out, just by letting the opposite or the paradox exist
Mm-hmm.
without you doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you,
Yeah, yeah, a
yeah.
letting be, a pure letting be of, or well, and that's interesting because then it's like a letting be of that which appears to be the option, the other, the
Mm-hmm,
alternative,
mm-hmm,
and then maybe that shows you in a way that what you thought was the only alternative was not the only alternative, you know, which is one of the, I would say, even just thinking personally, like that's the most, like the word inexhaustibility came up with Cadell, like because like like for example, depression is that aspect of the mind where you see only one alternative, like you know, my current state or this, and you say, well, it seems like this is the only thing. So, but releasement is that mindset where you start to see how, well, okay, even if there's one alternative, I can let that be, and then you start to see that even that alternative was framed by me as being the only alternative. Then you start to encounter a type of inexhaustibility, you know.
this is actually the difference between fate and destiny.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Where and I think this is like so important because people can't, like most people that don't read philosophy, like
Mm-hmm.
Christians or other like Abrahamic religions, they get stuck on this idea of like, if everything is already decided for me, then what's the point of me doing anything and so on? Like
Mm-hmm.
if I'm already destined to be in hell, then like what's the point? you know
Mm-hmm.
but the thing about destiny is kind of like exactly what you're talking about, is actually like running away from it is called fate, right? You're going to inevitably meet it, but
Mm-hmm.
embracing it is what is called destiny, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of you turn
Yeah,
yourself
then you
away, that is
can
destiny.
affirm. Then you can
Hmm.
affirm it because you realize that, yeah. So Zizek writes a lot about this, about destiny and predetermination. He talks a lot about what's there's a particular more American Calvinism, which starts on the premise that everything is predetermined. So
Mm.
like some people have been chosen by God to be saved, and the others haven't. So of course it's a very nihilistic, horrifying view of a good God, you know. But then Zizek takes that the philosophical import and says, well, in some logical way, like even if that's true, that is also the place of an absolute freedom, because even in our predeterminedness, i.e., if you're born in a particular class of people in a particular country, you're pretty much determined to live a certain kind of life because your opportunities are restricted according to a system. But in recognizing that, you can affirm your place and vocalize it and change, you know. So even within destiny, you can start to change because you see more than just one option.
Mm.
Because you realize the very structure of class is itself um, fabricated, you know. It's part of a social symbolic order, which is like the critique of capitalist realism, is to say, well, what you think is your class is itself a fabrication. So you can affirm your destiny in that class to then expose the illusion, you know.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
Buber actually says the same thing when, in the midst of realizing the determination, you set yourself free. Like once you accept the
Mm-hmm.
determination, you're actually the most free. Um, but yeah, so I guess we'll start wrapping up.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, it's a little bit late here now for
yeah,
me.
So just I usually ask this question to all Christians because I
Okay.
think it's a funny question. So,
Okay.
in your opinion, Zizek or Peterson?
Is that a question?
Yeah, yeah. Which one do you prefer? Which one do you like, Zizek or Peterson?
A question. I'm joking. That was a sarcastic answer as well. Um, the answer is very, very clear in my head, and I
Mm,
think we can maybe look at the references to Zizek that I've made in this conversation compared to
mm,
those of Peterson. But I feel like I know it's not good because Nietzsche says like resentment is the highest form of like um, non overman behavior.
mm,
But I really don't like Peterson
mm,
because I know friends that liked him,
mm,
and I watched some of his psychological lectures that he gave. Like, and I watched this like 7 years ago. So I was like, oh, okay, this guy's kind of interesting. Talks about Jung, talks about Nietzsche, talks about stuff like this. Talks about like affirming life and stuff. I was like, oh, sounds good. But then I quickly realized, and I still realize today, and no offense if you like him, by the way, he is affirming a type of identity of human beings which is itself nihilistic. And I think this creates a type of person who starts to change their behavior for the better. So like maybe they're just like going about their daily life in a dead end job, not happy. Haven't got many relations because society's enforced us all to kind of live in boxes. And they start to hear things like, oh, clean up your room, affirm yourself, here's some steps to guide yourself towards a better you. Of course, that always sounds good, but I think it creates a type of identity which then fails at certain points, i.e., you can't clean your room one day because you're tired. Then you start to feel guilt. Then you start to blame other people. Then you start to look at woke culture and blame them because they seem to be the root of all problems. And there's this whole self identity starts to build up. And I think Peterson was subject to this himself. So I don't like him. I don't think he's a deep thinker. Look at his debate with Zizek himself,
mm,
and you see that and like even my friends at this point watched this debate and said, "Wow, like okay, there's a different kind of depth, because I think what Peterson is preaching is like this ideal self. What Zizek is preaching is like the barred subject, the lack of the self. And I think
mm,
there's a different depth of conversation because I think exactly what you mentioned earlier, like when you annihilate the self, then a self comes, but like a self which is quite natural and let be instead of a self which is tried to be like neat. Like look at Pete. I saw a video recently. He was like crying and like trying to say like, oh, the only reason why all of us are in the situation we are is because we've lost our value system. You know, that's that that's terrifying because if you have to hold on to values to hold on to life, it creates a type of worldview that he has, which is a very negative nihilism,
mm,
meaning like, life is just a will to power, which is void. We just have to hold on for dear life and tidy our room every day. Otherwise, we're gonna fall into the abyss. And it's a type of like strain and stress, and I feel sorry for him in that sense.
mm,
Whereas Zizek obviously is a bit misogynist and whatever in his own way, but he still brings this kind of like proper deep insight into many aspects, which I prefer.
mm. Yeah, actually, I
Even if
think.
he says stuff as well, which I don't always agree with. It's the type of conversation where like this idea of the third pill. It's not just blue or red. It's like
Mm,
Peterson's like, okay, I'm the blue pill, and the rest of the culture's the red pill.
mm.
Zizek's like, well, maybe there's a third pill or a fourth or a fifth. Maybe there's a, a perspective. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I think you even brought this up with Cattell. Like every time you propose an opposite, there's
Mhm.
always a third
Mhm. Mhm.
within that opposite,
Mhm.
and that's why I like Zizek. I even like Zizek's like position again, like on Christian atheism. Like I think that's a very funny, like that's actually a very third position, actually, right? To
Mhm.
say, there's
Mhm.
Christian, there's atheist, and then there's Christian atheist.
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
but yeah, Peterson. Actually, I think the phenomenon of Peterson is actually interesting in the sense of that I don't. I agree. I'm not too much of a fan of Peterson, but I do notice that psychologically he
Mhm.
represents like the lack of a father figure. This
Mhm.
is why
Mhm.
like so many men sort of look towards him is because he actually is the embodiment
Mhm.
of the lack of a father figure. So that
Mhm.
they sort of crave that desire of a father figure, and that's sort of embodied in Peterson, and that's sort of, and here you can already see the sort of toxic relationship that is going on between Peterson and the world, because Peterson is already subjected to, without maybe even him realizing it, the father figure that is lacking for everybody else. And so
Yeah,
in that sense, he has to affirm values, because if he doesn't affirm values, then he isn't the father figure anymore. What is he then? He's nothing at that point. So
but
yeah,
that's maybe the point. But that's the point he needs to get to, is to realize that he is nothing. Because otherwise, I think, like, for example, a lot of people that are afraid of life, afraid of death, or afraid of the void, or the horror of the abyss, or the horror of what we human beings are capable of. Like, of course, it makes sense. We all are in a way. But I think this came up in the conversation with Cadell, the word abject. We have that fear when we think that there is a real nothingness. So I think maybe Peterson, in a way, and we all should confront nothingness more to realize that there is that what we call nothingness is itself subject to nothingness. So, like, we can't even characterize it as a negative thing, because we realize that even our idea of nothing was itself projected by us, you know? Then maybe he says, oh, you don't really need to clean your room, because you just don't need to do it because it's already clean, maybe. Oh, and then you can stop and pause a little bit and say, well, what do I need to do? And then you can say, well, nothing. And then that's when you start to cultivate an attitude which then says, well, okay, I can still criticize society, but I don't need to objectify. I don't need to do this. But then I can also do it because I want to, or I desire to, without imposing, you know? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything last bit you want to say, Thomas? I know.
No, but we can speak again soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great conversation.
Yeah. It really was. So many times, like, I always think, like, I should have gone into, like, I think my biggest, like, confrontation was that, I decided to go back to school after the army, and I
Okay.
had begun reading philosophy in the army and stuff. And I was like, oh, I want to do philosophy in, in academia, in academic world. But then I kept confronting this idea, right? And this is where, like, I'm not sure what position that I should have gone, because I started realizing that I started confronting the value of what people would call, like, pragmatic reason, right? Like, if I pursue philosophy, then it is possible that I might not have um, a job actually philosophizing, that it might not be for anything, and so on, and all these other problems that of, like, pure insecurity was arising from, like, what I would have done or pursued anyways.
Oh yeah, but I think we all have this in every respect of life, you know. But I would say with academia, like, for example, I'm doing my PhD now and it's not funded because I wanted to do it abroad, but I didn't. It's very complicated, but basically there wasn't enough credits, because if you want to study in Europe, which I did for my master's, you need to have done an extra year more than you would do in the UK. And to do philosophy in the UK, which I am in Scotland, to get funding is, like, almost impossible. So in terms of, like, pragmatic reason, it was not pragmatically reasonable to do what I'm doing now. But then I know after there are departments where I've studied before that are accepting, that are open, that do think in particular ways about Heidegger, Vatimo, Zizek, you know? So that means that, like, my risk of doing all of this, I see a light at the end of the tunnel. Of course, when I'm in the position, the type of reason that I would like to reason in can be restricted and limited according to the framework. But I think that's the risk of life, you know, in any respect, in anything we do. But then this is why it's also nice to see channels like yours, like Adele's, and even some of my friends and I were thinking of doing some conversations like this one, just because it's a way in which that restriction of reason, which does happen in institutions, can be flourished and opened up outside of, that setting, that framework. So yeah, but I would say with academia, like, cultivate yourself, cultivate your reading, enjoy what you're doing, write, do what you need to do, and then the rest will be history, you know. So then if you start to to write stuff like that interests people, that might also interest a certain department, and then you'll find it so easy to slip into.
Mm-hmm.
That's why with everything, I just say, like, first focus on yourself. And like what I said earlier about the Christian prayer time was like a cave time. Because if you don't have that time, you're going to be going into church and just listening to what people say and say, yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, yeah. Without questioning your own subjective,
Mm-hmm.
That's what philosophy is at the end of the day, Like,
Mm-hmm.
of course, it's good to read books to understand the history of phenomenology, the history of hermeneutics, the history of nihilism, the history of German nihilism. And of course, like, if you're working full time and you're doing that part time, it's a lot slower. So if you maximize your time doing it, why not? But it's just about being pragmatic, I think.
Yeah.
I hope we can speak soon.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think it was a wonderful talk.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, I'll probably add the link in my video about like your essays. I read both of your essays and I thought they were wonderful. I
A bit
think,
messy. They were a bit quickly written and quickly uploaded. But if you like them, then
yeah.
I trust your opinion. So
No, I mean, I think really like the essays really started getting me into the framework of negation, right?
okay.
Even if you feel like they're messy or maybe not fully panned out, it already started introducing the person. This is just my experience of reading it, of
Mm-hmm.
what it possibly means to release and what it
Mm-hmm.
possibly means to fall into like negation. So in that sense, I found the essays wonderful.
Okay.
And so I'll definitely link your website so that
Mm-hmm.
people can read it and sort of have. I know it is philosophically heavy
Mm.
of terms and stuff like that, but I think it is really good, and it's
I think I might spend some time and open them up a little bit, like edit them to make them more approachable.
mm,
So
yeah,
maybe in 5 months' time they'll be 5 times worse, or 5 times better, or clearer.
yeah,
So keep
yeah,
checking every day.
yeah. All right,
No, nice one. Thank you.
yeah. All right. With that, we'll close.
Mm-hmm.
See you guys.